in combination with the other measures, that would help to bring the R number below 1.
But as it says, with uncertainty. So it wasn't saying this definitively, but this is a harder position than we'd had previously.
And if we go over the page, please, to paragraph 23, I think this is where we see consideration being given to whether or not schools could remain open for smaller numbers of pupils. Is that correct?
Yes, and that built on both modelling and social science advice that had happened over the previous 6 weeks.
Thank you. That can come down. And again, can I just check whether or not it's right that as of the 18th of March, it's still, or was it possible to model or to say with any further certainty whether or not, whether or not there was more scope, for example, for certain years of children going to school, or whether this was as much as could be said?
It was really as much as could be said, and as you'll see from the way that they describe the 10 to 20% of pupils still being in school, it was relatively impressionistic. So it was saying this will probably not have a material effect, rather than putting a numerical number on that.
And was there scope at this stage for considering whether or not there were alternatives to the full closure of schools to most children? So, for example, whether or not children could have attended school on a rota basis, or whether or not consideration could have been given to children who were doing their A-levels or their GCSEs still being able to come into school at this point?
I think and this is in no sense a criticism, just this is a statement of fact, had, let's say, the Department of Education said, we accept that schools are going to have to close, but please can you see if the following group coming in would be material, then I think the modellers would have done their best to do that. I think they probably would have struggled given the very limited data we had at this point in time. I think it's difficult, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, to remember quite how small the numbers were relative to the huge numbers we had later, and modelling depends on having reliable data, so very big caveat. But that, I think, for the modellers to have off their own bat tried to model a whole variety of probably impractical things would have been very difficult. So I think that only would have worked had, and this may be important later in the discussion, had the policy people said to the modellers, this is one group we would like to get back. What do you think it'll do? I think that would have been a legitimate question to ask.
I think that depends, doesn't it, on people with the insight into education knowing about the groups of children that they would wish
Correct.
To prioritise.
It does.
And putting that forward to scientists.
Yeah, so it'd be quite wrong for me as a public health person, for example, to start speculating as to which groups are most important. The groups that were chosen were, in a sense, relatively obvious, yes. Which is children who are particularly vulnerable for a variety of reasons, mainly vulnerable in the kind of the wider social sense rather than necessarily the strict clinical sense. And then children of parents who, if the children were not at school, then the parents wouldn't be able to go to work, on whom society was absolutely going to depend. So NHS workers, for example, essential workers of other sorts, as you know, was decided.
And presumably within the modelling that was taking place, it was looking at broad percentages of children
yes.
that could possibly come into school. So within that broad margin, there may have been room for discretion as to which other children could have been prioritised. Is that right?
It is possible, but I think it would have been very much probably at 20%, it won't make a huge difference. I think it is worth, and this is maybe scrolling ahead a bit, but it's worth just saying that, in fact, the number of people who chose to take up the ability for their children to come into school was smaller than was originally anticipated. So as it turned out, there probably would have been room for other areas, but there's no way of telling that at this point in time. And this, I think, probably one of the other reasons why in practice schools would have ended up closing anyway, which was at this point in the pandemic was so little known. Parents were not confident about their children going to school, and a lot of parents were withdrawing them already.
And I think we probably will examine these issues a bit more, particularly when it comes to the second set of school closures. But just going back to the start, obviously the virus had advanced much further in China by this stage. Do we take it from all of your evidence thus far that there wasn't sufficient information or data available from China that enabled these sorts of questions to be, or these sorts of propositions to be modelled in England?
Yes, and for basically two reasons. Although our Chinese counterparts and colleagues actually were very generous with the information they gave, we had a long way from full visibility of all their data for perfectly good practical reasons. It wasn't because they were trying to hide it. So there was a lack of data. But the other thing was they essentially threw the kitchen sink at this immediately and closed down multiple things simultaneously, which included schools. But therefore teasing apart the component that was due to schools was virtually impossible, really, based on the fact it was all done simultaneously.
Thank you. So, Professor Whitty, just coming back then, and so that we're clear about the rationale for closing schools as announced on the 18th of March, and when I say closing schools, I mean closing schools to most children as opposed to completely. In your view, was it necessary that schools closed in order to bring transmission rates under control? I think that's the first question. And necessary in order to prevent the NHS from being overwhelmed?
Well, I think what I am confident about saying is that had schools not closed, and based on the evidence we had at the time, and I don't think evidence subsequently has undermined that, the peak of the pandemic would have been higher. And that would have had, obviously, direct effect from deaths from COVID in the first wave, but would have increased the risk of all the indirect effects from health services being unable to function that were already serious, and you've heard about that obviously in previous modules. So I think not closing schools would have had a material effect on the pandemic being significantly worse. That's a slight rephrasing of the question you've asked, but I think that's one which I feel confident I can say.
I'm grateful, and I think this will come, you've touched on an issue that I think perhaps we'll return to when we look at the consensus statement, but as you've alighted on it, perhaps I can just ask you now, is there a clear understanding now as to the effect that closing schools during the first period of school closures had, and whether it was the closure of schools that had the effect or whether it was the indirect impacts that had the effect, and whether it's possible to disentangle the two? And I hope that that does make sense.
That makes complete sense. I think that various people have made heroic attempts to do it. Were I in the unfortunate position of having to deal with another pandemic, I don't think the data is strong enough for us to actually be able to say with confidence, even the absolute effect of schools, although I think in overall terms I'm confident they brought the numbers down significantly, but exactly what the proportion was, I think, difficult to say. You can do it by modelling, but it's quite an indirect method, and certainly harder still to be confident about was it the direct component of children mixing or the indirect things that you have talked about in terms of, for example, the impact on parents meeting up and their behaviours.
That might be thought surprising to most people, because if the effect was really the indirect one, so for example that when children go to school, more parents go to work, the idea that that would justify the closure of schools
it's less to do
might seem very surprising.
Yes, it's less to do with parents going to work, although that may have been one issue, but it's things like parents meeting one another. So to take a step back, the key thing we were trying to minimise was households meeting, because once COVID got into a household, our view was it was likely to transmit a lot within the household. So the unit of transmission from that point of view was the household. If you have 3 parents from 3 different households meeting at the school gate, even if they're, unless they take very careful precautions, you run the risk that you're bringing together 3 households where one might be infected and the other 2 not, and that might not be the situation as of half an hour later. So I think that it is quite difficult to be absolutely sure, but the reason that it's difficult to tease apart with the benefit of the data we have subsequently is because so many things happen simultaneously, both directly as a result of government decisions. So the decisions that were taken on the 16th by the Prime Minister and announced by the Prime Minister, the decisions on schooling, and the lockdown happened in extremely short period of time. And then, of course, people were changing their own behaviours in response to the threat they saw, not to do with the way in which government was telling them to do things, but because they were using their own common sense about things they would do. If you put all of those together, they were all happening over the same very short period, and trying to pull apart, therefore, the individual components of this is really very difficult. Had we been in a situation where the decisions on the 16th, the school closures and lockdown were, let's say, 3 or 4 weeks apart, it would have been a lot easier at least to say what is the impact of schooling alone. It might or might not have been possible to have said something about the impact of the indirect versus the direct.
Thank you. I'm going to move on then, if I may, to ask you a bit about the impacts on children during that first period of school closures. I think it's right, isn't it, that prior to the pandemic, there were already some studies which had been done based on a number of other pandemics or outbreaks of illness like equine flu that enabled scientists to understand something about the psychological impacts of quarantine. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And specifically, there was some work or some research which had been done which demonstrated that quarantining children could have psychological effects on them as well.
Yes, I mean, in a sense, this is a statement of the obvious, but I think it still is worth saying that there's extraordinarily strong evidence that being in school, as just being in school, is very good for children, developmentally, educationally, in terms of mental health, arguably in terms of physical health data, and that's a bit less clear. And it's pretty obvious that having children isolated is not a natural situation and is not good for children. And in a sense, the scientific evidence all supports what common sense would tell people, yes. But it's all in a line, which is these are things you would not wish to do to children except under the most extreme circumstances. Unfortunately, we were in the most extreme circumstances. And I'll go back to probably almost my opening kind of comments about Module 2, which was all the decisions we had were very, very bad, and some of them were a bit worse and some of them were a lot worse. But these were bad choices to have to make.
And is it your position, Professor Whitty, it didn't take scientists to tell decision makers or policy makers that closing schools to most children or lockdown would cause these kind of psychological consequences that the studies suggested they would have?
Yes, I mean, I don't think there was anybody who I heard talking about this who wasn't absolutely confident, with or without scientific advice, that closing schools is a very bad thing for children and should be avoided at all costs. And I've read the witness statements of many of the political leaders, and they make that point, and that was their view. The science, in a sense, supported their view, but their view was the common sense view that I think every parent and every citizen probably would have.
I'm sure that that's correct. I think I'm asking you about something slightly different, which is the evidence that it wasn't school closure, it was quarantine, could have quite distinct psychological impacts.
Yes,
not just on children, I think on adults too, but there was specific learning.
Absolutely, and I think isolating people is bad at all stages of life. During periods of development, the implications are likely to be worse, and that's what the scientific evidence would certainly support.
So can I ask you then, just turning to the role of SAGE during this period, did SAGE have a role in monitoring the sorts of impacts that school closures were having on children and providing advice to government, or was that outside SAGE's role?
The important thing to remember is that SAGE is a scientific body, and its job was to look at scientific data. It didn't have any data collecting capacity of its own at all, and that wasn't its job. And indeed, I don't think it would probably have been particularly good at it, because that wasn't what it was set up for. It was the wrong people. So where evidence came out of scientific studies based on data collected by others, SAGE was in a strong position to help policy leaders, policymakers interpret that, and in particular to look at the strength of scientific assertions that were made in papers and in some other, and in what's called the grey literature, so unpublished studies. So it was able to do that, but what it wasn't able to do and wasn't expected to do was actually do the monitoring. That was very much done by organisations like DFE in the case of Education Public Health England, as it then was in the case of the public health interventions, NHS for the NHS interventions.
Can we maybe look at that distinction in terms of the advice that was given, and maybe look at INQ 00007 4924. So this is advice that's coming much later about the role of children in transmission. We can see this is the 16th of April 2020, so very much in the thick, as it were, of the first period of school closures. And if we look at 2, it says there's a consensus that evidence on the role of children in transmission of COVID-19 is unclear, with a number of gaps in understanding. And then it sets out a number of bullet points around that. So, for example, that there is limited information on the behaviour and contact patterns of children. And then at the final bullet, it sets out there's a lack of information on current experiences for children and parents. For example, in terms of variation in the extent and quality of home distance learning, attendance by vulnerable children, and changes on child protection safeguarding services, impact on parental mental health, etc., and an evidence gap around longer-term impacts for children, particularly around mental health and child development. Just looking at that, Professor Whitty, I think the first question is why that sort of advice, or why that is being incorporated, as it were, into SAGE's advice at this point. And I think the second point is, I think we know that there was evidence and information available from around this point about some of the impacts that arose, or that were certainly becoming patent at this point. So it's really just trying to understand SAGE's role and whether there's an issue here as to the sorts of evidence and information that was becoming available at this point being passed on, as it were, to SAGE.
Firstly, this is an example, and there were others in other areas, where we were moving at unbelievable speed almost every day, big changes in the data that was coming in up to and including the lockdown period. Once we were in that, we were able to write out in much longer form some of the discussions that were being had verbally in SAGE prior to that, in which we'd only communicated, and also set up subgroups. And the subgroup on children, which was chaired by the chief scientist from the Department for Education, Osman Rahman, at that time, what they were able to do is say, this is the state of knowledge. What they're saying here is not that there was no effect. What they're saying is that against normal scientific criteria, the data are not strong enough for us to be able to say, here is a review we can point to, here's a systematic review, here's a big trial, that can make these points really solid. We need to now test these and try and find information out about them. And we were aware, of course, that these questions were not just being asked in the UK, they were being asked all around the world. But I think if you'd asked scientists from around the world, remembering that science is an international discipline, was this a fair summary of what was known at this point? I don't think anyone would have said, no, that's not a fair summary of the gaps, and these gaps therefore needed to be filled. But in policy, you can't, the fact there's a gap in evidence in an emergency doesn't, you can't wait until that gap is filled. You have to make decisions and try and fill the gap and then adjust your course subsequently. And of course, we saw that multiple times during COVID.
So I think if we just took, for example, by this stage, it was clear that vulnerable children were attending school in very low numbers on the basis of the Department for Education's own data. So I suppose the question is, would that sort of information, or that being confirmed, was that going to change advice that was being given at this stage? If these were gaps that were being identified that were capable of being filled?
Well, I mean, whatever SAGE had said on this, and I think this is stage doing its job, which is not overstating things because it doesn't have scientific evidence, there was already a policy decision to ensure that vulnerable children could be in school,
yes.
and already a strong policy intent by DfE and social services and others to make sure that did happen. So the decision of whether or not to try and ensure that that was available and indeed made as easy as possible for children who are vulnerable was irrespective of this. This was a scientific point. The policy was going on regardless, and rightly going on regardless. That had already been decided.
All right. I mean, the reason I'm asking about this, and perhaps we can go on to look at this, is that social distancing, I think, was being reviewed at this stage. I know that we're probably coming up to a break. I think we've got 5 minutes. I think we can make some progress in that 5 minutes. But if we look, please, at INQ 000109 please. So this is the social distancing review of the 14th of April. So, I mean, it would seem that that kind of information and understanding the sorts of real-life impacts that the pandemic was having on children might be important and relevant at this point.
Yes, but again, remembering that a scientific advisory body should not go beyond the science. So its job is not to say, well, common sense would tell you. Its job is simply to go on the data that is currently available, which is considered to be strong enough to be able to say that.
Yes.
That's what policymakers rely on it to do.
Yes, and I think that we're coming to the issue really that's at stake here, which is where do those various bits of information feed into the decision making. If we just look at this social distancing review of the 14th of the 14th of April, and for example, I'm just picking this up, if we look at page 11, and paragraph 20, for example. So I think at this stage, relaxing restrictions on the use of outdoor spaces was being contemplated and allowing adults, I think, more freedom to go outside. Is that right?
Well, I think the idea was to make it possible to be more freedom to go outside in general.
Yes.
And I think it is possibly worth reflecting at this point that the restrictions on outdoor activities were much stronger in many other countries, for example, France, than they were in the UK. So we were, in fact, at the more liberal end amongst many of our peers. But I think there was quite a strong view among SAGE that outdoors was a lot safer than indoors already by this point, and that only strengthened as time went by, as the evidence came in.
And I think we see at the end of this, I won't read out the whole paragraph. It says it's important to note that such a relaxation should not cover shared hard surfaces such as children's playgrounds without nerve tag agreement.
I think the key word there is shared. It was the sharing, not the hard surface, that matters here. And it was really to ensure that people had thought through the implications of contact sports and a variety of other things at this point in the pandemic, when we were still at a very perilous point.
Thank you. That can come down. I mean, one of the issues, and that the inquiry has heard Module 8 has heard quite a lot of evidence about, is how the pandemic restricted children's ability to play. And it might seem surprising, given what was known, certainly by the 14th of April, that whilst a potentially more relaxed approach might be taken to adults' ability to go outside, that isn't being reflected in the advice that's being given about children's playgrounds, for example.
I think that's a slightly misleading way of putting it, because it implies that there was more restrictions on children than adults, which is not correct. The difficulty is that a lot of child's play, particularly in, for example, schoolyards, tends to be quite physical and tends to be quite physically close. And outdoors makes a big difference if you're talking about more than 2 meters apart for aerosol transmission, which has come up multiple times in the inquiry, so I'm not going to go into that in any detail. If you've got someone who's 2 inches apart from someone else, it doesn't matter whether it's indoors or outdoors. If they shout or sing or bellow or cough over them, that's ballistic, and that is not going to be, that you're going to get a transmission. And the key point on this, and I cannot stress this too much, is it's about households transmitting to other households. So if it was children playing within their own family, in due course within a bubble, variety of other things, that was not going to increase the risk. If you've got 12 different children from 12 different households all in a scrum together, then the potential for transmitting between households is going to be there. And so that was really the issue. And expecting children, particularly young children, to maintain the kind of strict social distancing that was relatively straightforward for adults has a certain, you have to have a certain reality about this. But there was no intention to disadvantage children, quite the reverse.
I think just going back to that bit of advice and about the hard surfaces, the inquiry understands, but this may be wrong, that was part of the reason why school playgrounds were not reopened until, I think it was the July of 2020, and then it was a matter for individual local authorities to risk assess the position. Is that correct?
That is correct. I mean, I think if we were running things again, this is one of the areas where I think I would have preferred a policy that was more liberal about children's play in reality, but that is a policy view which is not really my job. At this point, we didn't have scientific evidence to help us particularly, except for the point I've just made, which is when you're very close to someone, it doesn't really matter whether you're indoors or outdoors. Ballistic transmission or touch transmission is going to occur at just the same rate.
I understand the point you make, Professor Whitty, about it's a policy position on play, but given that you were in a position of being able to offer epidemiological advice and can reflect an epidemiological perspective to Module 8, that sounds as though the imperative for restricting children's play may not have been sufficiently strong to warrant the kind of restrictions that were placed on children's play.
Well, if I can go back to some repeated evidence that was given early on in February, March, repeated up to this point in April, one of the things that we said was there is no, I'm going to paraphrase a bit, but there's no point in closing schools if what we then do is recreate all the situations that lead to schools having children meeting together, and indeed their parents meeting together. They're just the schools are closed. There's nothing gained by that. So I think it was important in considering this, and I think policymakers were right to do this, that in the decisions that were taken, they didn't recreate the environment of schools, but without a school. That would have essentially defeated the huge sacrifice of having the schools closed in the first place.
But would it have been possible to take a more nuanced approach and perhaps say to parents, you can let your children, they can go outside and mix, but you parents mustn't congregate, for example, you must stay separate. I'm trying to explore what it is you think could have, what could have been relaxed in respect of children's play?
There is, well, at this point in the pandemic, and I think nothing overturned this actually, there was no evidence that children could not transmit to one another. So it's not magically that if you can just leave the adults out of it, the children can play happily together and nothing will happen. That isn't a reality in terms of the epidemiology of this. The difficulty was how to make it possible for children to play in a context where they were not going to recreate the situations you'd have in school or bring households together and therefore lead to transmission of infection in a way that otherwise would not have happened. And I think it's important that we don't get ourselves into a situation where we imply that there was a lovely outcome that could make play easy and it wouldn't have a negative epidemiological impact. It would do. I certainly think we could probably have done this in a more subtle way, and there might have been ways we could have done it which would have been better. But at this point in the pandemic, remembering in mid-April, we are still talking about an extraordinary impact on health, very large numbers of people dying, very large effects on the NHS. I think we had to be rational in the way we were doing this, and the policymakers were doing their best in the decisions they were taken to give children as much flexibility as possible, as well as adults outside, but without leading to a recreation of bringing households together. And that was really the tension. Yeah. Of course, everybody wants children to play, just as everyone wants children to go to school, and everyone wants people not to die of COVID. Unfortunately, those policy aims were essentially in some degree of tension.
And just in understanding all of that and the fears that existed at that time, in terms of the more subtle approach that could have been taken or could have been taken later on to play, practically speaking, what might that have looked like?
I think as we became increasingly confident that the outdoor environment was safer than the indoor environment, which we thought was probable, but the data for it was much less clear in April than it was later. I think probably it would have been possible to take, well, certainly, for example, increase the amount of time people could spend outside, and time outside was not in itself a risk. The thing which I'm repeating myself, but I'm repeating myself because I don't want this to come out as a recommendation of the inquiry and then cause problems in future pandemics. What we did, doing that at the expense of recreating chains of transmission between families, would undermine the effects of closing schools, which in themselves is a very bad thing for the development of children. So play is not the only thing. I'm completely sympathetic to the view that play is incredibly important to children, but the problem is that we had policy aims that were in tension.
So is the issue really about, and when I say messaging, it's also about people obviously complying with messaging as well, but there might have been more capacity for children to be outside and to play, but as long as it was within quite strict parameters and didn't involve the mixing of households.
Yes, and that in a sense, I think, is what that last document you showed me is hinting at, which is there is an environment where generally children tend to be very close together and in contact sports and so on. And then there are other environments, and the ones that we were concerned about were those sorts of environments that would recreate the effect of a school, but whilst the school was closed. And I wasn't involved in the policy decisions on this, but I'm just trying to explain the kind of logic behind it.
My lady, is that a convenient...
Just before we break, you said, Professor Whitty, if running again, I would have perhaps had a more liberal policy. Is that with the considerable benefit of hindsight?
No, I think the bit of the restrictions which at the time I thought we should have been more liberal, if I'm honest, was the amount of time that people could spend outside. I think I couldn't see the logic of that from an infection control point of view, to be honest. I think it almost happened by accident, and that I think probably is something we should have looked at, and for children in particular, I think that's very important. It's important for everyone.
Thank you very much. As you remember, we take regular breaks. I shall return at 12:05. All rise.
Name, please.
Christopher Whitty.
Professor Whitty, I think you ought to have before you two witness statements which will come up. I think the first bears the number INQ 000 588046. Yes.
I'm just waiting for that now. Thank you.
And are you content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I am.
And you ought to then have a second witness statement in Module 8, which is in fact your 10th witness statement in this inquiry, INQ 00 0588 220. Yes?
Yes.
And are you content that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I am.
Thank you. Professor Whitty, I was going to begin your evidence at the start of the chronology, if I may, and ask you some questions about the outset of the pandemic. And specifically, if you can explain why SAGE first contemplated the closure of schools on the 4th of February 2020.
Thank you. So, in the pandemic, and based on the information we initially had from colleagues in China and then subsequently from other countries, notably Italy, we were confident that this was a respiratory pandemic, or at least a respiratory epidemic that had a potential to turn into a pandemic at the earliest stages. Secondly, we had reasonable evidence, not convincing evidence overwhelmingly, but reasonable evidence that children were relatively unaffected in terms of severity. We didn't have any evidence about really that was convincing on whether there was any reduction in transmission, and we thought there was a possibility that it was transmitting quite extensively through children but with no or very few symptoms, so that was a possibility. In the context of respiratory epidemics and pandemics, and the best evidence for this is from influenza, which is a very different pandemic in some ways, but has some similarities, particularly the route of transmission. We know that the closure of schools has been associated with reductions of transmission, significant reductions of transmission in the case of influenza. And the reason for that is that children tend to mix together quite a lot. And in the case of influenza, and this was an important difference which we recognised from the beginning, because there's often some residual cross-reactivity from previous flu pandemics, there's often a disproportionate amount of transmission in influenza in children during. There are a number of other technical differences between the early evidence, but our view was that from an early stage, the closure of schools is one of the tools that has been used.